It was the summer of 2004, and the town was alive with the usual rhythm of school life. The days were long, the afternoons hot, and the hallways of the small high school were filled with laughter, chatter, and the shuffle of sneakers on polished floors. Among the many students, there were two girls who stood out not because they were loud or popular, but because they were inseparable. Everyone knew them as best friends. Where one went, the other followed. They shared everything: lunches, homework, secrets, and dreams of the future. Teachers often smiled when they saw the pair walking side by side, whispering jokes only they seemed to understand. That year had started out like any other. The girls were busy with assignments, after-school activities, and small teenage adventures. They weren't the kind of kids who made trouble. They came from good families, respected their teachers, and had plans for college. People admired their bond. Friends said they were like sisters, tied together by something deeper than friendship. Both had an energy about them, the kind that made others feel lighter just by being around. But all of that was about to change in a way no one could ever have imagined. One afternoon, the final bell rang and students streamed out of classrooms, heading for buses, cars, and bikes. The two friends walked together, laughing about something that had happened earlier in class. They stopped at their lockers, gathered their things, and waved goodbye to a couple of classmates. That was the last time anyone saw them. When evening came and the girls didn't return home, their parents grew worried. At first, there was hope that maybe they had decided to spend the evening at a friend's house without calling. But as hours passed, phone calls were made, neighbors were asked, and no one knew where they were. Their beds remained empty that night, and the uneasy silence in their homes grew heavier with every minute. By the next morning, panic had set in. The families contacted the school, hoping for answers. Teachers shook their heads, no one had seen them after the final bell. Their classmates repeated the same story: they had left school together, smiling, as usual. That was all. The police were brought in, and the town was suddenly flooded with concern. Flyers with their photographs appeared on telephone poles, in grocery stores, and in every corner of the neighborhood. Search parties formed quickly. Friends, families, and strangers combed through woods, parks, and empty buildings. Helicopters circled overhead, and volunteers called out their names, hoping for a response that never came. Days turned into weeks. Rumors began to spread. Some believed the girls had run away, chasing freedom and adventure. Others whispered of darker possibilities. But those who knew them best insisted that wasn't who they were. They wouldn't leave their families behind, not without a word. The town clung to hope, but every day without news made that hope harder to hold on to. The school felt emptier without them. Their lockers stayed untouched, photos still taped inside, books left behind, and little notes folded neatly as if waiting for their owners to return. Their friends would sometimes sit in silence at the cafeteria, glancing at the two empty seats where the girls always sat. Teachers spoke softly about them, careful not to upset students, but everyone could feel the weight of absence. The police followed every lead they could find. They interviewed classmates, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen something unusual. There were tips that went nowhere, phone calls from strangers claiming to know something, and sightings that turned out to be nothing at all. Every time hope rose, it was crushed again. It was like chasing shadows. The families never stopped searching. The parents grew thinner, their faces marked with worry lines that hadn't been there before. They appeared on local news stations, begging for answers, begging for their daughters to come home. The community rallied behind them, organizing vigils and lighting candles in honor of the missing girls. Yet as months slipped by, those candles became symbols of grief rather than hope. Still, the memory of the girls lingered. People remembered their laughter echoing in the halls, the way they carried themselves, the dreams they had spoken of. Stories about them were told again and again, keeping their presence alive even as the years tried to erase it. 8 years is a long time to live in uncertainty. And in those 8 years, the disappearance of the best friends became a mystery that never left the town's heart. It was a wound that refused to heal, a question that had no answer. The world around the families moved on, new students filled the classrooms, seasons changed, and people built new lives. But for those closest to the girls, time seemed to stand still. Their story, though, was far from over. Hidden beneath the surface of that small town was a secret waiting to be uncovered, something that would only come to light years later in the most unexpected way. The days after the disappearance turned into weeks, and those weeks turned into months, but the absence of the two friends remained like a shadow over the town. It was as if their laughter had been erased from the hallways, their footsteps wiped from the sidewalks. Life around the community went on. The buses still picked up students, bells still rang at the school, and families still gathered for dinner each evening, but for those closest to the girls, nothing was the same. Every morning, their parents woke with the same heavy question pressing down on their hearts: where were their daughters? Posters with their faces stayed taped to walls and windows. At first, they were bright and fresh, with bold letters spelling "missing" at the top. But as time passed, the sun faded the colors, the paper curled at the edges, and rain left stains that blurred the smiles of the girls. Volunteers would replace them with new ones, determined to keep the town from forgetting. But even new posters couldn't erase the ache of not knowing. The police continued their work, though each passing day seemed to pull the mystery further from reach. Detectives followed leads that ended in dead ends, tips that led them to empty roads or false sightings. There were times when hope would suddenly rise. Someone claimed to have seen two girls matching their description in a nearby city, or a stranger called in with a story, but each time, disappointment returned. Families would answer the phone holding their breath, only to hang up with their hearts heavier than before. The parents of the girls grew closer through their pain. They leaned on one another when the grief was too much to bear alone. At vigils, they stood side by side, candles flickering in their hands, faces lit by both flame and tears. Their voices trembled when they spoke about their daughters, but they spoke anyway, because silence felt worse. They wanted the world to remember that these were not just names on a missing poster. They were daughters, sisters, friends. At school, their classmates struggled to adjust. For a long time, 2 seats remained empty in the classroom. Teachers didn't reassign them, as if leaving them untouched was a way of holding on. Friends remembered little things: the way one of the girls would doodle in the margins of her notebook, the way the other hummed softly when she was nervous. The smallest details became treasures, reminders of who they had been before that afternoon when everything changed. But as the seasons shifted, and new years of students filled the school, the absence became something unspoken. Freshmen who entered years later only knew their names from whispers, from the faded photos on bulletin boards. For them, the girls were part of a story that belonged to the past, but for the families, time had not dulled the pain. Police kept revisiting the case. Files stacked higher, boxes of reports filled shelves, yet still there was no answer. Detectives would sit together in dim rooms, staring at photographs of the girls, trying to see something they had missed. They traced maps, reread statements, and searched the same areas again and again. They wanted to believe that the truth was still within reach. But mysteries have a way of burying themselves deep, and this one seemed determined to stay hidden. The town, though supportive, carried the weight of suspicion. People wondered if the truth had been nearby all along. Neighbors who had once trusted one another now looked differently at each other. A stranger walking through town could feel the unease in the air. Parents held their children closer, warning them to never walk home alone, to always call before leaving school. The loss of the girls had stolen not only 2 lives but also the sense of safety the town once carried. The families tried to keep hope alive. Birthdays came and went, celebrated quietly with cakes and candles that weren't blown out by the ones who should have been there. Holidays carried an emptiness no words could fill. There were moments when a mother would wake in the middle of the night convinced she heard her daughter's voice, only to sit in silence, realizing it was a dream. A father might drive for hours, scanning roadsides, fields, and highways, searching for something, anything, that might give him an answer. By the 4th year, the case was officially cold. It wasn't that the police stopped caring, but without new evidence, there was nothing left to chase. For the families, hearing those words felt like losing their daughters all over again. Yet they refused to let the memory fade. They continued to speak their names, continued to ask questions, and continued to hope that someday, somehow, the truth would surface. The community held annual gatherings at the school. Friends, neighbors, and classmates gathered around candlelight, reading poems, sharing stories, and releasing lanterns into the night sky. Watching those lights drift upward was both painful and healing. It was a way of saying the girls were not forgotten, even though no one knew where they were. 8 years is a long time to live without answers. By the 8th anniversary of their disappearance, the families had grown older, their faces marked by sorrow that time could not erase. Younger siblings had grown into adults, carrying memories of sisters who had vanished when they were still children. The town, though changed, still carried the weight of the unsolved mystery. And then, in the 8th year, something completely unexpected happened. A small fire broke out in a neglected field not far from the school. At first, no one thought much of it. Fires happen, and firefighters know how to handle them. But when the smoke cleared, and the scorched ground revealed something long hidden beneath the earth, the story of the two best friends shifted once more. What had been buried by time was about to be uncovered, and the answers everyone had been waiting for were finally beginning to surface. The summer of 2012 had been long and unusually dry. The fields around the small town had turned from green to a brittle shade of yellow. Grass crunched underfoot, and farmers complained that even the morning dew seemed to vanish before it touched the soil. That summer, one careless spark was all it took for a fire to start. It began as a thin line of smoke, unnoticed at first, in a field that had been abandoned for years. By the time someone saw the flames and called for help, the fire had already spread quickly, eating through the dry grass and bushes. Fire trucks roared into the area, their sirens piercing the quiet town. Neighbors gathered at a safe distance, watching the firefighters spray water into the flames. The blaze lit up the sky in shades of orange and gray, and for hours, crews worked tirelessly to keep it from spreading toward nearby homes. By evening, the fire was finally under control. The ground was blackened, the air smelled of smoke, and the once overgrown field now lay exposed, its secrets no longer hidden under grass and weeds. At first, no one expected the fire to reveal anything unusual. It was simply an accident, the kind of thing that happens in dry summers. But as the smoke cleared and officials inspected the area to make sure the fire was completely out, something caught their eyes. In the scorched soil, partially buried, were objects that seemed out of place. The earth had shifted, and with it came hints of belongings that did not belong to the land. A fragment of fabric, discolored by time and fire, peeked through the ash. Nearby, what looked like the corner of a shoe stuck out of the soil. The officials called the police immediately. Soon the quiet field was surrounded by yellow tape. Investigators walked carefully over the charred ground, their boots crunching against ash. They crouched, examined, and exchanged quick glances with one another. Everyone understood without saying it aloud, this was no ordinary discovery. News spread quickly. The families of the missing girls heard about the fire first, then about the strange objects found in the ground. At first, they tried to steady their hearts, afraid of what this might mean. For 8 years, they had lived in the painful space between hope and despair. Could it be possible that this field, so close to where it had all begun, held the answers they had begged for? Excavation began carefully the next morning. Investigators returned with tools, photographers, and specialists trained to handle delicate evidence. They dug slowly, brushing away soil, lifting fragments with gloved hands, documenting every inch. With each movement of earth, more pieces emerged, clothing items faded and worn, small objects that looked like they had once been carried in pockets or school bags. There was no mistaking that these things had belonged to the missing friends. As the digging continued, the truth of what lay beneath the ground began to reveal itself. Investigators uncovered skeletal remains, their fragile outlines preserved in the soil. Time had passed, but the bones still carried the story of who had been buried there. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Everyone present knew what this meant. The girls who had vanished in 2004, whose names had been whispered in sadness for years, were finally found. Word of the discovery reached the families, and their world shifted in a single breath. The call they had waited for had come at last, though not in the way they had ever hoped. For years, they had prayed for a miracle, dreamed that one day the girls would walk back through the front door. Instead, they were faced with the reality that their daughters had been here all along, buried in a field that no one had thought to search. The town was shaken. Neighbors gathered outside the taped-off area, standing in stunned silence as investigators carried out evidence. Journalists arrived with cameras and microphones, reporting live from the edge of the field. People who had once whispered theories now stood quietly, unsure of what to say. The discovery was both a relief and a heartbreak. Relief because the mystery had finally been uncovered, heartbreak because of what it meant. The investigation quickly shifted gears. With the remains recovered, officials began the painstaking work of identifying them formally and uncovering what had happened. Every small item found alongside the bones was examined carefully. Pieces of jewelry, notebooks, and personal belongings were collected and studied. Each object told a story of lives interrupted, of young girls who had carried dreams and laughter with them on the last day they were seen. For the families, the waiting began again, though this time in a different way. They waited for confirmation, for results from forensic tests, for the official words that would say what their hearts already knew. They sat together in their homes, the weight of grief pressing down on them, but alongside the grief was something else, an end to the uncertainty that had haunted them for 8 long years. The police reopened the case with renewed urgency. Detectives combed through old files, revisited witness statements, and looked at the evidence with fresh eyes. They asked themselves questions they had asked before, but now with the remains found, the answers seemed closer. Who had brought the girls to that field? How had no one seen anything? Was the truth hidden all this time in plain sight? The town, once more, became the center of conversations. People who had lived there in 2004 recalled details they had long forgotten. Old suspicions resurfaced, and new theories took shape. It was as though the fire had not only cleared the field but also reignited memories that had been buried under time. The discovery became more than a headline. It was the beginning of closure, but also the beginning of a new wave of questions. For the families, it was bittersweet. They finally knew where their daughters were, but they also knew the hardest part was still ahead, learning the truth of how they ended up in that field. The scorched earth stood as a haunting reminder of the years lost, the unanswered questions, and the fragile line between knowing and not knowing. What had begun as an accidental fire turned into the most important turning point in the case. The field, once ignored and forgotten, had become the place where secrets finally broke free from the soil. And so, in that summer of 2012, the mystery that had hung over the town began to shift. For the first time in 8 years, there was something solid, something real. The best friends who had vanished so suddenly had been found, and their story, long left unfinished, was now moving toward the truth. The days after the discovery were unlike anything the town had experienced before. The field, once forgotten, became the center of constant activity. Police cars lined the road, investigators worked under bright lights late into the evening, and news crews crowded the area with their cameras pointed toward the scorched earth. For years, the story of the missing best friends had been told in whispers and faded posters. Now, it was everywhere, on every screen, every newspaper, and every heart. The families waited anxiously for confirmation, though deep down they already knew. When the official results finally came, the words hit like a stone dropping into still water. The remains were confirmed to be the 2 girls who had vanished 8 years earlier. Tears fell quietly as parents held photographs close to their chests, whispering the names they had spoken 1,000 times in prayer. The hope that had once carried them was now replaced with the reality of grief. They finally had answers, but answers did not erase pain. With the confirmation, the investigation turned into a hunt for truth. Detectives who had once shelved the case reopened every file. They pored over old statements, reviewed maps, and interviewed witnesses who had been teenagers back in 2004 but were now adults with clearer memories. The discovery of the girls brought back emotions for everyone who had known them. Friends remembered their last conversations, teachers recalled their bright smiles, and neighbors thought about the afternoons when the girls would pass by laughing, full of life. The police focused on the field. It was strange that it had never been searched properly before, even though it was not far from the school. Why had no one thought to look there? As investigators studied the site, they realized that the field had once been overgrown and nearly inaccessible. The tall grass and tangled bushes had made it easy for things to remain hidden. When the fire cleared the land, what had been buried finally came into the open. Evidence collected from the field provided more than just the remains. Small details, the placement of the items, the way the ground had been disturbed began to form a picture. Detectives pieced together theories, careful not to rush. Forensic experts examined everything, and each new discovery was added to the puzzle. Slowly, a story began to emerge, one that suggested the girls had not simply disappeared but had been deliberately hidden. The town's reaction was mixed. There was sorrow, of course, but also anger. People wanted to know who was responsible, how such a thing could have happened without anyone noticing. Families gathered in church halls and community centers, speaking in hushed voices, trying to comfort one another. Parents hugged their children tighter, unwilling to let them out of sight. Even after 8 years, the fear returned, reminding everyone of how fragile safety could be. For the families, each day was heavy. They remembered the birthdays missed, the holidays spent in silence, the years of unanswered questions. Now, those questions demanded more than ever to be answered. They sat with detectives, asking again and again how this could have happened, who could have done it, and why it had taken so long to find them. The detectives promised they would uncover the truth, but promises did not quiet the restless nights. One detail gave investigators a new direction. Among the belongings found was an item that didn't seem to belong to the girls. It was something out of place, something that hinted at another presence. This detail, though small, opened new paths. Detectives began to consider whether someone connected to the school or the nearby neighborhood might have been involved. People who had once been questioned lightly were now looked at with sharper suspicion. The search for answers spread beyond the field. Investigators revisited the old routes the girls had taken after school, retraced their steps, and spoke again with anyone who might have seen them that day. Some remembered small details that hadn't seemed important at the time: a car parked oddly near the school, a stranger who lingered too long, a sound in the distance. Each detail was added to the growing picture. The pressure on the police grew. The families wanted closure, the town wanted justice, and the world beyond was watching closely. Reporters followed every development, headlines filled with speculation, and the mystery that had haunted the town now captured the attention of people far away. The story of the best friends was no longer just a local tragedy, it was something that touched hearts everywhere. As the investigation deepened, so did the emotions. For the families, it was a daily struggle between sorrow and determination. They spoke of their daughters often, not as victims but as bright souls who had once filled their lives with joy. They shared stories of their laughter, their dreams, and the way they had always looked out for each other. Even in the face of tragedy, the bond between the two friends remained the heart of the story. The climax of the case came when investigators found new evidence linking the field to someone who had once lived nearby. Records showed that in 2004, a person with a troubled past had frequented that area. Suddenly, a name resurfaced, one that had been mentioned briefly years before but dismissed due to lack of proof. Now, with the remains uncovered, the details seemed to align. Detectives followed the lead carefully, gathering enough information to confront the possibility that the truth had been closer than anyone had realized. The families braced themselves as the investigation moved toward a possible answer. They had waited 8 long years, and now the moment was approaching when the hidden story might finally be revealed. But the waiting was unbearable. Each knock at the door, each ringing phone carried the weight of expectation. They lived in the space between fear and hope, knowing that the truth, no matter how painful, was finally within reach. The town, too, held its breath. Conversations filled coffee shops, neighbors exchanged theories, and old memories resurfaced. Everyone wanted to know what had really happened in 2004, who had taken the best friends away, and why it had taken so many years for the truth to come to light. The fire that had cleared the field had done more than reveal remains, it had reignited the determination of an entire community to uncover justice. As investigators prepared to announce their findings, the air felt charged with tension. The families gathered together, holding hands, leaning on one another for strength. The truth was about to be spoken, and once it was, nothing would ever be the same again. The day the truth was finally revealed was heavy with silence. The families, who had waited for nearly a decade, sat together in a room filled with detectives, lawyers, and officials. Papers rustled, pens clicked, and faces looked grim. When the words were spoken, they carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. The girls had been taken from the world too soon, and their resting place had been hidden in the field all that time. The explanation was not simple, and the details were painful, but they brought an end to the long season of wondering. For the families, the news landed with mixed emotions. There was grief, deeper than before, because hearing the truth made the loss feel final. But there was also relief that they no longer had to live in the gray space between hope and despair. Now they knew. Now they could stop searching. For years they had lived in a storm of uncertainty, and at last, the storm had cleared. It left behind sorrow, yes, but also a kind of peace. The town responded with compassion. Vigils were held again, but this time they carried a new meaning. Candles were lit not in the hope of return but in remembrance. People gathered in the school gymnasium, filling the bleachers, speaking softly about the girls. Photographs were displayed on large boards, the girls smiling at birthday parties, standing side by side at school dances, laughing in classrooms. Friends shared stories, teachers wiped tears, and even strangers felt the weight of the tragedy as if the girls had belonged to everyone. The funerals were held on bright days, the sky clear and blue as if the world itself wanted to honor them. The processions were long, with people lining the streets, heads bowed, hands folded. Flowers covered the ground, their colors vivid against the gray pavement. Songs were sung, prayers whispered, and promises made that the girls would never be forgotten. For the families, it was the moment to say goodbye, though goodbye was never truly possible. Justice followed in its own way. Investigators had gathered enough evidence to hold someone accountable, and though the process was slow, it brought a sense of closure. It was not enough to heal the wounds, but it was something, a recognition that the truth had been found and that silence had finally been broken. The families no longer had to wonder who, or how, or why. They had answers, and those answers became the foundation for moving forward. In the years that followed, the story of the best friends became a lesson for the community. At the school, a memorial garden was built. Students planted flowers, teachers placed benches, and a small plaque carried the girls' names alongside the words "Forever Remembered." It became a quiet place where classmates could sit, reflect, and feel connected to the memory of two lives that had touched so many. New students who never knew them learned their story, and in that way, their legacy lived on. For the parents, life would never return to what it had been. Their homes carried the echoes of laughter that was no longer there. Birthdays and holidays came with an emptiness that time could not erase. Yet, they found strength in honoring their daughter's memory. Some organized scholarships in their names, helping other young people achieve the dreams the girls never had the chance to fulfill. Others spoke at schools, reminding students to value friendship, family, and safety. In sharing their pain, they gave meaning to their loss, turning grief into guidance for others. The story of the best friends also became a symbol of resilience. People who read about it far beyond the town found themselves reflecting on the fragility of life and the importance of community. The families received letters from strangers across the country, letters of support, prayers, and words of comfort. It amazed them that their daughters, even in their absence, had touched the hearts of people they had never met. The town itself changed. The field where the remains were found was no longer a place of neglect. It was cleared, blessed, and turned into a green space where children could play safely. The families wanted it to be a place of life, not death, a reminder that even in the face of loss, hope could grow. Whenever the wind blew across the grass, carrying with it the laughter of new children, it felt like a soft echo of the joy the best friends had once shared. Years later, when people told the story, they didn't focus only on the tragedy. They spoke of the bond the girls had, the way they looked out for each other, and the light they brought into every room. Their story was no longer just about loss, it was about love, friendship, and the way two lives could leave a lasting mark on the world. The families carried their memories with them every day. Sometimes, when the sun set just right, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, a mother would pause and think of her daughter's smile. Sometimes, when music played faintly in the background of a store, a father would remember how his daughter used to hum along. These small moments of connection reminded them that love never truly ends. As time passed, the pain softened, though it never disappeared. The families learned to live with it, to carry it with strength rather than letting it crush them. They found comfort in the thought that their daughters had been together until the very end, just as they had been in life, best friends, side by side. The story closed not with silence but with remembrance. The town, the families, and everyone touched by the girls' lives continued to carry them forward. Their laughter might not echo in the hallways anymore, but it echoed in the hearts of those who loved them. And though the years would move on, their story remained, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface.